one of the first projects I worked on. We bought a product from a company and we spent a bunch of time trying to integrate it. And I was like, it can't be this complicated. So I did some searching. I found like an open source product that did the same thing, put together a POC, and our CTO at the time was like, oh, this is really interesting. So we ended up replacing the product we bought with this open source solution. And I was like, that's really cool that, you can kind of make impact like that in this space, because it was ripe, if you will, for new kind of innovative thinking, rather than just like doing what people had always done.
So Ryan,
Yes.
Thank you for being on the show. Why don't you start with telling us who you are?
Sure. So Ryan Eldridge, I'm the CTO at Liberate. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, married, 2 young children, been in insurance for roughly the last decade, started in the health space, migrated to P&C.
And if you think about your skill set, what you do, you could have chosen anything in anything in any industry, doing anything, related to technology. What made you choose insurance?
I'm not sure that it originally started as a choice. When I finished school, I finished a little early. I got a job offer. My plan was not necessarily to immediately go to work, but my dad said, I'm not going to pay for anything else. So I took the job, and that was in the health space. And I found it interesting in a strange way that like everything felt really antiquated, and it felt like a space, in the health space, it felt like there was a lot of like impact you could make by doing kind of small things, but introducing new technology. One of the first projects I worked on, we bought a product from a company and we spent a bunch of time trying to integrate it. And I was like, it can't be this complicated. So I did some searching. I found like an open source product that did the same thing, put together a POC, and our CTO at the time was like, oh, this is really interesting. So we ended up replacing the product we bought with this open source solution. And I was like, that's really cool that, you can kind of make impact like that in this space, because it was ripe, if you will, for new kind of innovative thinking, rather than just like doing what people had always done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I call this podcast the Insurance Experience Podcast. And, my desire to do this was I come across so many people in the industry who are doing all different kinds of things, technology, customer service, underwriting, claims, and others, that I started asking myself the question about who are the people who work in these companies? What do they do? What's the story behind them? And this is why I call it insurance experience, right? So, the experience of insurance, or the experience of the people who work in this industry. So what's been your experience with insurance as a consumer? Have you ever filed a claim?
So I've had, I would say, relatively limited exposure to having to deal with insurance. I mean, obviously I have it, but just over a year ago, I was coming home from the grocery store, and frankly, I just wasn't paying enough attention, and I ran into somebody, and, it was painful in some ways, but I guess I was at fault. So I felt like the pain was created by myself, but there was a massive lack of communication. So I had to get my car assessed, and then, they wrote an estimate. It was dramatically off, and so then I got to take it in to get repairs. And, it was like literally 3 or 4 weeks longer than what the estimate was. Nobody got in touch with me. The way I figured out that my car wasn't going to be done is because I got an email from Enterprise that they had extended my rental car. And I was like, why? And they were like, oh, because your car's not done. And I was like, why is the rental car company telling me this, not the insurance company or the auto shop, you know? And it feels like there's a disconnect in the way they think about communicating, where it's very much like, if I want to call in, wait on hold, to talk to somebody, I can find out that status, but it's 2024. That feels very much like a push scenario rather than a pull. So, that's my latest experience with insurance. I think that, as I said earlier, I think it's just extremely ripe for opportunity to to make this better for the consumer. And I think, for the carriers or the agencies or whoever you're working with to create a better like customer experience for people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was already in the insurance industry for quite some time before I'd ever needed to interact with my insurance company. But my excitement or interest in working in this industry was first ignited when I filed a claim on my own. It's a totally different experience, right? Like you go in and you have to go through the journey that you keep talking about or pontificating about. It's, going through that and experiencing that on your own gives you so much insight into what you could do differently or better, or what could be sort of more promising or a much more innovative way. So on that note, if you look at and you probably look at this industry from a technology lens and an opportunity lens, what's the most promising or exciting thing about the industry, and maybe focus more on broadly, not specifically what we do?
I think my answer is going to be kind of expected by most, and it does dovetail into what we do. But I think that, the advancements we're seeing in AI right now are, kind of like unbounded. And I think that that specific space, when applied to enormous amount of industries, can accelerate things dramatically. But I don't just mean in like, what we do specifically, but in decision-making support, in underwriting support, the idea of fine-tuning specifically to your business needs or a niche of your business needs is something we haven't had access to. I mean, you and I did this years ago. We're, building a fraud model, for example, right? And the amount of time, energy, effort, data that was necessary, and data engineering that was necessary to build a model and then validate the model. And you're like, oh, we had, team of people working on this, and it took, I don't even remember how long, but now it seems like you can do that with like a much smaller data set in like, no time at all.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to think about anything else that would have right now in this exact moment, anything else that would have that same level of impact. And it's not just about fraud or claims. It's about decision support systems for, customer service, any aspect of of most verticals right now. You can see how you can apply this technology, and it's a game changer.
Yeah. I was reflecting back on just a couple of years back, right? Like we used to hire data scientists, product managers, engineers to build these data science models. And what struck me was that in the last 3 years alone, something that would typically cost an insurance company or a technology company selling into insurance anywhere from $5 to $15 million to do is now one API call away that costs anywhere from 5 to 15 cents.
Yep.
And that massive change in the economics of this is fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Like where this can go eventually.
And I think that kind of plays into what I was saying, is that like potentially some of what we're seeing now was accomplishable a few years ago with a larger team and more investment, but also the cost of that, not just the upfront cost, but the maintenance cost, the infrastructure costs, all of the other things that I think about. Now it's, to your point, it's like every 6 months, the cost goes down. It gets faster, it gets smarter, and it gets cheaper. How can you find any other piece of technology that kind of is moving the needle as much as that is?
Yeah. So I'm going to end this conversation with sort of a question I ask everybody, which is, if you could make one prediction about the future, okay, so from where you said looking out, what's that one thing that you think that nobody's thinking about but might happen?
So I don't necessarily know that nobody is thinking about it. It's maybe unique to my life, but I as I said earlier, I have small children, and my wife works, and so we have 2 vehicles, right? But I don't really need a second vehicle for the vast majority of the time because I work from home. So it's like I drop my kids off at school. Sometimes I have to pick them up, whatever. And so I think the idea of like vehicle ownership will change in some some portion of time. You see this with boats, right?
Yeah.
People buy like a share of a boat and they have access to that. I see the same thing with vehicles, especially as specifically being here in San Francisco, seeing all the Waymo vehicles driving around. And it's like the idea that I can buy a portion of a vehicle, have access to it at certain times, and I don't actually need it to be at my house. As long as it can come at, at a time that I need it, it would fit my lifestyle specifically like so well. I don't know that that's like, something that nobody's ever thought of. But it's something I think about a lot because I'm like, oh, it would be like so much more convenient for me.
So like timeshare for cars?
Yeah. Yeah. And then, again, not to get hyper specific to the world we kind of live in, but then that upends the insurance space in a totally different way.
Yeah.
But it also becomes like a consumer benefit where you're paying for a share of a thing because that's really all you're using. If I think back to the Metromile days of pay per usage, it gets interesting to me. And I think about it like almost every day when I look at my car sitting in the driveway and I was like, that hasn't gone anywhere in 2 days. You know what I mean? So that's a kind of prediction that I am hopeful will come true, is that someday I can just buy a quarter of a car instead of a whole one.
Awesome. Ryan, thank you for being on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me.